Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Weekly. I'm your host and moderator, Aaron Porras, and with me today to discuss the latest in Israeli geopolitical developments are returning panelists Dr. Martin Sherman, the founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, and Avihu Sofer, a teacher of political science at Haifa University and a Ma'ariv columnist. Now today we're here to talk about the Iran-Turkey alliance and Iran's growing influence in Syria, but first, just ahead of upcoming meetings with White House peace envoys, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has essentially thrown up his hands, saying, what's the point? In a recent meeting with Israeli lawmakers, Abbas made allegations that he's met with Trump envoys at least 20 times over the past year, and that his concerns have consistently fallen on deaf ears. Further, he claims the White House is feeding different answers to the PA than it is to Israel. And finally, with recent events in Virginia, coupled with the shakeup in the White House staff, Abbas says there's not much hope for anything to come from this administration anyway. So the question is, first, what has Abbas been asking for that he isn't getting? Second, what is the Trump administration really telling each party? And third, does Washington have a plan that they could actually push from their position? So moving right into it, starting with our first question, what has Abbas been asking for that he's not getting? Avihu, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think what Abbas has been going through is some kind of crisis. It's the crisis not only in his relations with the U.S., but it's a crisis with his relations with the Israeli authorities. After what happened with the Temple of Mount, that crisis where they stopped the defense cooperation, meaning Abbas, that was very proud of his cooperation with the Israeli.
He was proud of cooperation with Israel?
He was proud because this was basically the only thing that kept a good connection between him and the Israeli authorities. The fact that he has been cooperating with the IDF and with the Israeli intelligence. Now this has been stopped, or formally has been stopped. I don't know if beneath the ground it's happening or not, but formally it has been stopped. And Abbas is in a problem, he's in a corner at the moment. Now he sees that the Trump administration is supporting Israel according to his eyes. And Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner are people that are kind of thinking the same ideas, or at least presenting the same ideas that Benjamin Netanyahu is presenting. And Abbas is in a corner now. He's in such a corner that he made a very weird act this week. He sent a greeting telegram to Kim Jong-un from North Korea, who's known to be the biggest fighter at the moment to the Trump administration, which is very weird. Now another little thing that shows that the state that he's at is that he was threatened to be stopped with the financing of the U.S., the $370 million that America is supporting.
Taylor Force Act.
Yeah, and he says, okay, let's stop it, meaning something is unclear in Abbas's reactions to the U.S. Of course, it's a stupid mistake because Abbas is not a person to threaten America, so definitely not in the position that he's at the moment. But
I'm going to move the topic. I'm going to move it over to you, Dr. Sherman, because what I'm hearing necessarily is not that Abbas has been given answers that are different from Israel's, but rather answers that he doesn't like.
Well, I think coming on the heels of Jared Kushner's recent statement that there may not be a solution to the problem, if you remember, some time ago, perhaps this is the beginning of a dawning realization that the two-state solution is basically a hazardous hallucination. Because, and I believe you talked about it before, the structure of the bargain that needs to be struck, that needs to be enacted between Israel and the Palestinians is basically insoluble. The most that Israel can offer and still retain its minimum security requirements is far less than the Palestinians can accept if they want to set up a viable state, if you believe that's their real objective. So I think basically the two-state solution is running out of options. Unless Israel makes perilous concessions, you will not be able to find a partner on the Palestinian side. And if Israel doesn't make it, you still won't be able to find a partner on the Palestinian side. So I believe that what's happened is that basically the mask is being torn off the feasibility of the two-state. You know, there was a couple of years ago, there was a very thorough study made at the institute run by Dori Gold, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, with a bevy of generals from the former chief of staff, the head of the IDF intelligence, and they came to the conclusion that for Israel to have defensible borders, it needs to retain the western slopes of Judea and Samaria, the eastern slopes of Judea and Samaria, and control of the airspace and the electronic spectrum above Judea and Samaria. So even if they're wrong by a factor of 2, there's still no territory that you can relinquish to set up a Palestinian state. So if Israel is prudent in preserving its security conditions, even the minimum security conditions, there's no room for a Palestinian state. And so I think this is the kind of desperation or despair that we're seeing in Abbas at the moment.
I will add a little political comment to it. I think Netanyahu is interested in the negotiations. He's interested that the negotiations will be active. He's not interested in reaching to any solution, which is correct because there's no partner at the moment. And and I agree with what the doctor said in regards to to make sure that the security of Israel has been kept. But having a negotiation active, with Jared Kushner coming and going, with Jason Greenblatt coming and going, with Abbas saying this, Abbas saying that, Netanyahu saying something else. And at the moment, it's good for Israel. It's good that the negotiation is active. It's not good that there's no negotiation at all, and there's no connection at all, and especially that there's no defense cooperation. Because for Abbas and for Israel, it is important because nobody wants at the moment any riots, and Abbas is a partner to a certain extent, and I'm saying it very carefully, to a certain extent in the defense cooperation. It is important for Israel and for the Palestinians. But as far as what Israel is interested politically, Israel and Netanyahu is interested in the negotiation will be kept. That it will reach to some kind of agreement? Of course not. No, that something will come out of it? Of course not.
But then going back to
I must take issue with that, if I may. Okay. Because I think what's happened over the last 2 decades, that Israel has adopted a policy of trying to avoid confrontations which it may win, or which it can win.
So we should go out of our way to make a confrontation?
And backing itself into a confrontation which it may not be able to win, which perhaps connects to our next subject with the emerging alliance between Turkey and Iran. But I think by carrying on negotiations which lead nowhere, Israel is being forced backwards and backwards and backwards. If you compare Yitzhak Rabin's last speech in the Knesset in 1995, where he set out his vision for a permanent solution between Israel and the Palestinians, if Benjamin Netanyahu were to embrace Netanyahu's paradigm verbatim, he would be dismissed today as an unreasonable extremist. So by carrying on this facade or this pretext that somehow we can reach an agreement, Israel is being forced.
We can reach an agreement. That there is a negotiation. Nobody wants to reach an agreement at the moment because there's nobody to speak to. Abbas is not the partner. You know what, he doesn't control the Palestinian authorities. And there's no. And I agree with what you said before. There's no point in an agreement because Israel needs to keep its security. But having some kind of small fire negotiation is not bad.
I think
it's better than having riots and confrontation when it's not needed. You know,
that's exactly what I'm saying. By trying to avoid confrontations which you can win, you're going to back yourself into a confrontation in which you can't. And by continuing the negotiations, you basically what you're doing is legitimizing the idea that somehow a two-state solution is possible, rather than biting the bullet and taking it off the table.
It's not relevant only to the two-state solution. It could be other solutions. The only problem, which I agree with you, in what's happening at the moment is that they do not allow building in Judea Samaria. And this is a problem. There's no reason why we wouldn't build in Jerusalem, in Judea Samaria, and in other places. The fact, the status quo...
disputed territory is how they...
Well, of course it's disputed territory, but everything is disputed in the Middle East.
I mean, okay,
and unless...
But I wanted to touch
unless you take it, somebody else will take it. You know, the Palestinians are building...
But I wanted to talk about something earlier that you were discussing, that because Dr. Sherman, you discussed, a map about defensible borders and how we would absolutely... that Israel, in order to retain defensible borders with a Palestinian state, is far less than what the Palestinian Authority would accept. But that's been the basis of talks since 1967.
Precisely.
So the ideology, though, is that should we ever enter negotiations with the idea of having it with an end game of a two-state solution, that's what a compromise is.
Well, I'm a political scientist. and I'm not driven by any sort of religious fervor. And I'm telling you as a political scientist that between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, there will either be total Jewish sovereignty or total Arab sovereignty. And the side that will prevail is the side whose national will is the strongest and political view is the sharpest. Because there's no way that you can divide sovereignty between the river and the sea and reach a stable configuration. And I think the last quarter of a century since the signing of the Oslo agreements more or less bears that out.
All right, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the first subject, so let's move on. For our second topic, Turkey and Iran are beginning to come together, and it doesn't seem like anything good for the Middle East could possibly come from that. The General Chief of Staff of Iran's military has just visited the Turkish capital, meeting with top Turkish officials, as well as President Erdogan himself. With all the recent action in Syria and the Middle East as a whole, the explanation appears to be that they're uniting against a common enemy, the Sunni Arab states and Israel.
They don't want emergence of a new regional order led by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. Turkey is still very much unhappy with what Iran do in the broader region, particularly from Yemen to Iraq to Syria. So it's very much compartmentalized relationship. It is, as the American says, some kind of frenemy.
So the first thing is, what goodwill is being undone by the alliance between Turkey and Iran, between Israel and Turkey?
Well, I should imagine a great deal of goodwill if you ever believed there was. I think that there are a number of lessons to be learned here. First of all is that international relations are very unstable. The relationships between Turkey, for instance, Syria and Turkey has seesawed widely over the last few decades. Up until the late 1990s, Turkey and Syria were enemies, or at least rivals. Then when Erdogan came into power, the relations improved, and now they've degraded again. And the same thing is likely to happen with Iran. I mean, Iran and Turkey have never been great friends. They've been on opposite sides in the civil war in Syria. And I must take issue with them. One of their enemies is not the Sunnis, because Turkey itself is Sunni. So they're on opposite sides of the Sunni Shia divide. But I think this for Israel, this illustrates a number of things. First of all, I think the rapprochement with Turkey was very imprudent and ill-advised, because you will never be able to set up the kind of relationship.
Israeli rapprochement with Turkey.
Yeah, because the relationship of Turkey to Israel is not defined by what Israel does or doesn't do. It's defined by what Israel is, which is a big difference from the situation that prevailed in the 1990s, where you had a secular westward-looking Turkey. But ever since the ascent of the Islamist party there, that's changed, and changed for good, unless there's going to be a massive regime change in Turkey, which I don't see happening. Secondly, it shows that Israel has to be very careful, because there were times when people thought we could relinquish the Golan. If we had relinquished the Golan, you would now have Iranians on the Golan. You'd have an expeditionary force, Iranian force overlooking the Kinneret. And if you were to relinquish, by the way, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, you might have an Iranian expeditionary force overlooking Ben Gurion Airport and Highway 6.
So I want to get in. I want to get into a slight tangent to that, though, is that with the rapprochement between Turkey and Iran, Iran is of course seen as an enemy to the majority of the Sunni states, to the Sunni Arab states, which includes Jordan, and Jordan was just meeting with Erdogan shortly after the rapprochement between Turkey and Iran. So are we seeing a unification of countries around us?
We're seeing a total mess in the Middle East, where you see that Israel is trying to make sure its interest will not be disturbed.
Well, it sounds like the Arab states are doing the same thing, where they're just trying to tread water here.
One second. The story is much more complicated. Iran and Turkey were on both different sides during the war in Syria. The Iran was supporting Assad, Turkey was against Assad and was helping the rebels. That's one thing.
Apart from the Kurds.
Yeah, because of the Kurds. And that's the story. The story is the Kurds. The Turkish are very disturbed and worried about what's happening with the Kurds, that Americans are are helping them, arming them, financing them, supporting them in many different ways.
And Israel, by helping the Kurds in negotiations
Israel
with
is
the
trying
United
to,
States?
I don't know if Israel helping or not helping and doing it quiet or not, but you have two big players in the game, which is Russia and the Americans. And then under them, you have smaller players who are still in the game and might be disturbed in a direct way because they are living here. The Americans and the Russians are not living here, but they have interests in the Middle East and they're playing their chess game on our back. Now, we are trying to stop Iran. Iran is the big story. With all the respect to Abbas and the Palestinians, they are not interesting anyone. They are not the story here. The story is Israel and Iran. Iran is trying to create a corridor coming from Iraq, going through Syria,
northwestern
Hezbollah
Syria,
in Lebanon, and some different organizations in Gaza as well. This is creating a situation where they are surrounding us with Iranian forces. Now, this is not a game. This is not Syria, which is disarming now and disturbed with all its problems. And it's not even Lebanon and the Hezbollah. It's a big country. It's a strong country. It's a state which could attack Israel conventionally and non-conventionally very soon as well. We need to be very, very careful. Not careful, even worried. And this is why I think Netanyahu is rushing a meeting with Putin, because what's happening in the Middle East is becoming very problematic, because having the Iranians on the Golan Heights, having the Iranians in Lebanon, having the Iranians in Iraq, having the Iranians in the sea is creating a possible war where Israel has half of its hands tied, because we do not want to get into any tension with the Russians as well, which are not allowing us to act freely 100%. So there's so many players here. We're sitting in a table where you have 10 players, each one has different interests. But we are here. We need to protect ourselves because nobody will protect us. Not the Americans, neither the Russians, and neither the UN. So we need to keep our interests. This is why I think Netanyahu is rushing to the meeting with Putin, because we do not want to make a mistake and attack the Russians as well.
So to know our interests and to avoid any
our interest is to keep Iran
issues,
as far as possible.
Of course. So, but then we need to look at.
And it's not only our interest; it's the Saudis,
but then we
it's
need
the
to look
Jordanians,
exactly at what Iran has been doing. So if we're looking at that, we have, like you said, Iran has been shoring up territory in northwest Syria, creating this corridor.
Exactly. And now
apparently
Turkey as well.
It's
an extra problem, because Turkey is a strong country. Turkey was fighting the Russians nearly. A few months ago, they had a dispute with Putin, because they dropped the plane.
Hold on, I think you
Please
have to
don't
interject.
There are wider implications as well, because Turkey is a member of NATO. Now, if this alliance begins to develop and Turkey develops a close relationship with Iran, what does this mean for NATO? Can NATO afford to have one of its members in a close alliance with one of its potentially greatest enemies? And for Europe as well, it makes a big difference. When Turkey was a secular civil society democracy, with limitations, of course, but it was a secular country. Europe could count on facing the Islamic extremists on the eastern border of Turkey. But if Turkey now is aligned with Iraq, that front moves with Iran. That frontier moves to the eastern frontier of Greece, which is a completely different story. So there are huge international implications for this, and I think again this illustrates the short-sightedness of Israel's rapprochement with Turkey, especially giving Turkey a special status in Gaza. Because if Turkey becomes active in Gaza and has experts...
And the Temple of Mount, when there was a dispute in the Temple of Mount, all of a sudden Erdogan has something to say about it. There is no connection to it. He's just trying to flame the Middle East.
Former relations with Turkey, as close as they were, are gone. You cannot have any security cooperation with Turkey because they're now allied with Iran. And as I say, there's something Israel can do about it. The new relationships depend not on what Israel does or doesn't do, but what Israel is. And you can't change what Israel is. And so I think that we have to discount any possibility of a future alliance of any strategic value with Turkey. And Israel must look out for itself and start building its own independent power, which would, of course, would open up a debate about the security budget.
Yeah, I'll just another comment to what the
Sure,
doctor
Ben,
said.
and
The
I
other
next
problem
question.
is that the Americans became very passive at the moment in the Syrian story. At the beginning, Trump, you know, he was the first one to attack the Iranians in Syria and so on. At the moment, seems like Trump took a step backwards, and the Russians are much more active than the Americans. Now, Israel is probably, not probably, Israel is basically, you know, the hands of America in this organization. The Iranians are the hands of Russia. Now, having the Russians very active and having the Americans not active is creating a disbalance as well in the situation. Now, adding Turkey to the Iranian and Russian side is creating a total disbalance. Let's not forget, they signed a $7 billion gas deal just the week before. The chief of staff that came, a deal that Iran, Russia, and Turkey are partners of, you know. This is becoming more and more complicated because now money is involved, deals are involved, gas is involved, and, you know, having Turkey not on our side, but with the Iranian side, is very, very worrying. And this is the story at the moment. The Palestinians, Abbas, the problems in the little, you know, the little attacks that we have in Judea and Samaria is things that Israel can deal easily with. Iran is becoming more complicated. Israel can deal with it, but it's not simple because the Russians are here, and Israel do not want to get into any conflict with the Russians.
So let's complicate things further. I mean,
They are complicated enough.
I know.
We're living in the most
They're
complicated
plenty
neighborhood,
complicated,
you know?
but let's complicate things a little bit further and talk about the recent reports we've heard of North Korea having 2 shipments over the past year of sarin gas being caught on the way to the Assad regime. Now, Assad, of course, has promised multiple times. He's signed international agreements saying that he's dismantled his chemical weapons programs and weapons.
Signing is one thing, doing is another thing. Assad will use anything that he has.
Well,
you know?
So what position, first of all, who has the sarin gas now if they were caught, you know?
I think that any weapons
the
that,
UN
that I
says
think that
they
any
caught it,
weapons
but
that Assad, quote unquote, has will reach Hezbollah hands. All the bombings that you've seen, and by the way, the chief of the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force said that Israel attacked more than 100
times. The United
times.
Nations allowed these weapons to, even after catching them on their way to Assad, they allowed it?
cannot know what's happening in Syria. Look what they're doing. They killed thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of kids with sarin gas, with bombs, with barrels thrown from the... These are animals,
Well,
I'm sorry to say. But one word I want to say. There was an interview with the chief of the Air Force, Amir Eshel, that just retired or is retiring at the moment, and he said that Israel has attacked more than 100 times Hezbollah
over the border in the last
over
few
the
years.
border. Iranian trying to shift weapons to the Hezbollah. And that's what's happening. The weapon is coming to Syria. From Syria, it's going to the Hezbollah. If Israel attacks, then it will not reach the Hezbollah. And Israel should carry on attacking, but we need to be very careful not to get into
final
conflict with the Russians.
Which,
All right.
by the way, all this whole development underscores the I would say imbecility of the Obama foreign policy.
True.
No, we don't.
Because for Obama, Erdogan and Iran were the flavor of the month, and now what we're seeing is this emerging.
Well, I hope that the situation.
No, he's the one that cooked
unfortunately
this
will-
mess.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put all blame on.
We know
on a
you
single
don't- you disagree
presidency.
with us, but
I
that's the
don't
facts.
want to. I don't want to put all the blame onto a single presidency. I think that would be.
No, but he created a mess and then left.
I think that argument. I don't want to get into the speculation and because that's a whole nother argument for a whole nother day. We have about 30 seconds. I want to give each of you about 10, 15 seconds for your good word, our positive note to end on, our silver lining of you. 15 seconds.
No, please. Silver lining is a pretty rare commodity at the moment, you know, because I'm not. I just hope that Israel's military strength and political foresight are stout enough to navigate these very narrow straits.
That's a silver lining I can get behind.
Yeah, I will add to the doctor's words, seeing what's happened in Charlottesville in the U.S. as well, and you both know the U.S. very well, and seeing the Jews are not safe anywhere in the world apart from Israel, I think we should all keep the strength here in Israel and make sure that as many Jews as we can will come to Israel, and that Israel will keep not only its political and defense forces, but its spiritual forces as well, because we are building a special place here.
So that is unfortunately our time for this edition of ILTV's Israel Weekly. I'd like to thank our guests Avihu Sofer and Dr. Martin Sherman for coming in, and thanks to all of you, of course, for tuning in. Join us again next week, and shalom from now from Israel.